Sparrow Force was a detachment based on the 40th Australian Infantry Battalion and other British and Australian 8th Division units during World War II. The force was formed to defend the island of Timor from invasion by the Empire of Japan. It formed the main part of the Allied units in the Battle of Timor. Background: in December 1941, the Dutch requested that Australian forces be sent to both Kupang and Ambon under provisions that had been agreed to in a conference at Singapore earlier in the year. That plan, entitled Plans for the Employment of Naval and Air Forces of the Associated Powers in the Eastern Theater in the event of war with Japan, had already resulted in the disposition of forces, including some U.S. fleet movements, as early as November 1941. Initially, Australian plans were to send forces only to Kupang, with the resulting order to embark the force at Darwin, designated Sparrow, on the 7th of December 1941 using the transport SS Zealandia and the armed cruiser HMAS Australia, which were available in the port. The decision to exclude Ambon was quickly changed, with 1,090 troops designated Gulf Force sent to Ambon from Darwin on the 14th of December using 3 Dutch merchant ships. In January 1942, the Allied forces on Timor became a key link in the so-called Malay Barrier, defended by the short-lived American-British-Dutch-Australian command under the overall command of General Sir Archibald Wavell. Additional Australian support staff arrived at Kupang on the 12th of February, including Brigadier William Veal, who had been made the Allied commanding officer on Timor. By this time, many members of Sparrow Force, most of whom were unprepared for tropical conditions, were suffering from malaria and other illnesses. The airfield at Penfew in Dutch Timor also became a key air link between Australia and American forces fighting in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur. Penfew came under attack from Japanese aircraft on 26 and 30 January 1942, but the raids were hampered by the British anti-aircraft gunners and, to a lesser degree, by P-40 fighters of the 33rd Pursuit Squadron, United States Army Air Forces, 11 of which were based in Darwin. Composition: the majority of Sparrow Force personnel were from the 40th Infantry Battalion, which had been formed in Tasmania and was part of the 23rd Australian Infantry Brigade. The force was initially commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Leggett, although later command was taken over by Brigadier William Veal before being passed on to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Spence. A commando unit, the 2nd Independent Company, was also part of Sparrow Force. With the other forces from the 23rd Brigade, it shared contingents from 18 Anti-Tank Battery, the 12th Field Ambulance, 23rd Brigade Signals and the 11th Field Company. Zealandia departed Darwin on the morning of the 10th of December 1941 with 957 troops escorted by HMAS Australia, with another 445 troops reaching Kupang on the 12th of December. Rabaul fell to the Japanese on the 23rd of January, followed by Ambon on the 3rd of February, and both Gulf Force and Lark Force were destroyed. Sparrow Force was reinforced on the 16th of February 1942 with 189 British anti-aircraft gunners from A and AMP C troops of the 79th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery of the Royal Artillery, most of whom were veterans of the Battle of Britain. They were attacked by Japanese bombers as the ship anchored at Tenau. Later that day, an Allied convoy carrying reinforcements and supplies to Kupang, escorted by the heavy cruiser US Houston, the destroyer US Perry, and the sloops HMAS Swan and Beauregard, came came under intense Japanese air attack and was forced to return to Darwin without landing. The reinforcements had included an Australian Pioneer Battalion, the 4th Pioneer Battalion, and the 49th American Artillery Battalion. Sparrow Force could not be reinforced further, and as the Japanese moved to complete their envelopment of the Netherlands East Indies, Timor was seemingly the next logical target. The 240th and most Sparrow Force units were based at Februari airfield outside the capital of Netherlands Timor, Kupang. The 2nd Independent Company was based across the border at Dili in Portuguese Timor. Sparrow Force units HQ Sparrow Force 20 troops, 240th Infantry Battalion 944 troops, 2nd Independent Company 282 commandos, 2/1 of a stone heavy battery RAA 132 gunners, 189 gunners. 75th Light Aid Detachment 14 troops, 2/1 of a stone fortress engineers 56 sappers, 2/1 of a stone fortress signals 39 signalers. B Troop 18th Anti-Tank Battery RAA 27 gunners. Number 2 Section 2 11th Field Company RA 66 sappers, 23rd Brigade Signals RASC 8 signalers. 12th Field Ambulance RAAMC 50 medics, 22nd Dental Unit RAAMC 5 medics. Australian Army Service Corps 20 servicemen. Battle. On the night of 19/20 February 1,518 troops from the Imperial Japanese Army's 228th Regimental Group, which formed part of the 38th Division, 16 Army, under the command of Colonel Sadashi Chido, began landing in Dili. Initially, the Japanese ships were mistaken for vessels carrying Portuguese reinforcements, and the Allies were caught by surprise. Nevertheless, they were well prepared, and the garrison began an orderly withdrawal, covered by the 18-strong Australian Commando No. 2 section stationed at the airfield. According to Australian accounts of the resistance to the Japanese landings at Dili, the commandos killed an estimated 200 Japanese in the first hours of the battle, although the Japanese army recorded its casualties as including only 7 men. Native accounts of the landings support the Australian claims, however. Another group of Australian commandos, No. 7 section, was less fortunate, driving into a Japanese roadblock by chance. According to Brad Manera of the Australian War Memorial, despite surrendering, all but one of the number were executed by the Japanese. Outnumbered, the surviving Australians then withdrew to the south and to the east, into the mountainous interior. Van Straten and 200 Dutch East Indies troops headed southwest toward the border. On the same night, Allied forces in Dutch Timor also came under extremely intense air attacks, which had already caused the small RAF force to be withdrawn to Australia. The bombing was followed up by the landing of the main body of the 228th Regimental Group, 2 battalions totaling around 4,000 men, on the undefended southwest side of the island, at the Paha River. 5 Type 94 tankets were landed to support their Japanese infantry, and the force advanced north, cutting off the Dutch positions in the west and attacking the 240th Battalion positions at Februari. A Japanese company thrust northeast to USU, aiming to cut off the Allied retreat. In response, Sparrow Force HQ was immediately moved further east, towards Champlong. Leggett ordered the destruction of the airfield, but the Allied line of retreat towards Champlong had been cut off by the dropping of about 500 Japanese Marine paratroopers for the 3rd Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force near USU at 22 kilometers east of Kupang. After heavy resistance around the village of Babao and a second airdrop of 300 paratroopers, Sparrow Force cleared the village by the night of the 21st with plans to move eastward in the morning. By then, the Japanese had dug in defensive positions on Usua Ridge with a mountain howitzer and heavy machine guns near the road. After an Australian mortar and machine gun barraged Captain Johnson of A Company, Captain Roff of B Company and Captain Burr of C Company led the platoons in a bayonet charge up the ridge, followed by R Company. Gunners of the 2/1 over Stone Heavy Battery and sappers of the 2/1 over Stone Fortress Engineers reinforced the infantry platoons in the action. After the devastating assault on the paratroopers, Sparrow Force had killed all but 78 of the 850 paratroopers. Sparrow Force suffered only a few dozen losses. Sparrow Force was then attacked from the west by the main Japanese force of about 3,000 men with tanks and artillery units. By destroying the bridges as they advanced east, Sparrow Force achieved only a brief respite. By the morning of the 23rd of February, Sparrow Force had been engaged from the rear by the main Japanese force once again. With his men low on ammunition, out of food and water, weary from little sleep, and hopelessly outnumbered, Leggett surrendered at Arikum on the 23rd of February. Both forces were bombed by Japanese aircraft in two waves at 10 a.m. and 10:10 a.m. and more men from both sides were killed. More Japanese then landed at Kupang, which brought the numbers up to about 22,000 in Dutch West Timor. The 240th Battalion had suffered 84 killed and 132 wounded in the fighting, while more than twice that number would die as prisoners of war during the next 2.5 years. Veal and the Sparrow Force HQ force who were at Champlong and not in the main column at Arikum, including about 290 Australian and Dutch troops, continued eastward across the border, to link up with the Two Halves Independent Company. After months of training, some formed Platoon D of the 2nd Independent Company. Between the capitulation at Arikum and the 19th of April 1942, the communication link with the Australian mainland was broken. By the end of February, the Japanese controlled most of Dutch Timor and the area around Dili in the northeast. However, they could not move into the south and east of the island without fear of attack. The 2nd Independent Company was specially trained for commando-style stay-behind operations, and it had its own engineers and signallers. Although it lacked heavy weapons and vehicles, the commandos were hidden throughout the mountains of Portuguese Timor, and they commenced raids against the Japanese, assisted by Timorese guides, native carriers and mountain ponies. Although Portuguese officials under Governor Manuel de Abreu Ferreira de Carvalho remained officially neutral and in charge of civil affairs, both the Portuguese and the indigenous East Timorese were usually sympathetic to the Allies, who were able to use the local telephone system to communicate among themselves and to gather intelligence on Japanese movements. However, the Allies initially did not have functioning radio equipment and were unable to contact Australia to inform them of the continued resistance. DOI sent the Australian Honorary Consul, David Ross, also the local Qantas agent, to find the commandos and pass on a demand to surrender. Spence responded, "Surrender. Surrender be fucked." Ross gave the commandos information on the disposition of Japanese forces and also provided a note in Portuguese, stating that anyone supplying them would be later reimbursed by the Australian government. Australian commandos continue to resist. April-August 1942, force intact. still fighting, badly need boots, quinine, money, and Tommy gun ammunition. In early March, Veal and Van Stratton's forces linked up with the 2nd Company. Included in this group were several specialist electrical engineers: Captain George Parker, Signaller Keith Richards, Corporal John Donovan, Signaller Jack Lovelace, and Sergeant Jack Sargent. Built a radio out of recycled parts, which they called Winnie the War Winner, and re-established contact with Darwin. Supplies were soon airdropped to the guerrilla force, followed by continuing resupply from the sea. The Japanese High Command sent a highly regarded veteran of the Malayan Campaign and the Battle of Singapore, a major known as the Tiger of Singapore, to Timor. On the 22nd of May, the Tiger, mounted on a white horse, led a Japanese force towards Remexio. An Australian patrol, with Portuguese and Timorese assistance, staged an ambush and killed 4 or 5 of the Japanese soldiers. During a second ambush, Ray Aiken shot and killed the Tiger. Another 24 Japanese soldiers were also killed, and the force retreated to Dili. On the 24th of May, Veal and Van Stratton were evacuated from the southeast coast by RAF Catalina, and Spence was appointed commanding officer, after being promoted to lieutenant colonel. On the 27th of May, Royal Australian Navy launches successfully completed the first supply and evacuation missions to Timor. In June, General Douglas MacArthur, now the Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific area, was advised by General Thomas Blamey, Allied Land Force Commander, that a full-scale Allied offensive in Timor would require a major amphibious assault, including at least 1 infantry division. Because of this requirement and the overall Allied strategy of recapturing areas to the east in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Blamey recommended that the campaign in Timor should be sustained for as long as possible, but not expanded. This suggestion was ultimately adopted. Relations between Ferreira de Carvalho and the Japanese deteriorated. His telegraph link with the Portuguese government in Lisbon was cut. In June 1942, a Japanese official complained that the governor had rejected Japanese demands to punish Portuguese officials and Timorese and civilians who had assisted the invading army. On the 24th of June, the Japanese formally complained to Lisbon, but did not take any action against Ferreira de Carvalho. Meanwhile, DOI once again sent Ross with a message complimenting Sparrow Force on its campaign so far, and again asking that it surrender. The Japanese commander drew parallel with the efforts of Afrikaner commandos of the Second Boer War and said that he realized it would take a force 10 times that of the Allies to win. Nevertheless, DOI said he was receiving reinforcements, and would eventually assemble the necessary units. This time Ross did not return to Dili, and he was evacuated to Australia on the 16th of July. In August, the Japanese 48th Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Yuichi Tsuchihashi, began arriving from the Philippines and garrisoned Kupang, Dili and Malacca, relieving the Ito detachment. The goal was to outnumber the commandos by 100 to 1. The Japanese estimated Sparrow Force to be battalion strength in East Timor. Tsuchihashi then launched a major counter-offensive in an attempt to push the Australians into a corner on the south coast of the island. Strong Japanese columns moved south, 2 from Dili and 1 from Manatuto on the northeast coast. Another moved eastward from Dutch Timor to attack Dutch positions in the central south of the island. The offensive ended on the 19th of August when the main Japanese force was withdrawn to Rabaul, but not before they secured the central town of Maubis and the southern port of Beko. The Japanese were also recruiting significant numbers of Timorese civilians, who provided intelligence on Allied movements. Meanwhile, also in late August, a parallel conflict began when the Maubis rebelled against the Portuguese. During so September, the main body of the Japanese 48th Division began arriving to take over the campaign. The Australians also sent reinforcements, in the form of the 450-strong 4th Independent Company, known as Lancer Force, which arrived on the 23rd of September. The destroyer HMAS Voyager ran aground at the southern port of Batano while landing the 4th, and had to be abandoned after it came under air attack. The ship's crew was safely evacuated by HMAS Kalgoorlie and Warrnambool on the 25th of September 1942, and the ship destroyed by demolition charges. On the 27th of September, the Japanese mounted a thrust from Dili towards the wreck of Voyager, but without any significant success. By October, the Japanese had succeeded in recruiting significant numbers of Timorese civilians, who suffered severe casualties when used in frontal assaults against the Allies. The Portuguese were also being pressured to assist the Japanese, and at least 26 Portuguese civilians were killed in the first 6 months of the occupation, including local officials and a Catholic priest. On the 1st of November, the Allied High Command approved the issuing of weapons to Portuguese officials, a policy which had previously been carried out on an informal basis. At around the same time, the Japanese ordered all Portuguese civilians to move to a neutral zone by the 15th of November. Those who failed to comply were to be considered accomplices of the Allies. This succeeded only in encouraging the Portuguese to cooperate with the Allies, whom they lobbied to evacuate some 300 women and children. Spence was evacuated to Australia on the 11th of November, and the 2nd Commander, Major Bernard Callanan, was appointed Allied Commander in Timor. On the night of the 30th of November, the 1st of December, the Royal Australian Navy mounted a major operation to land fresh Dutch troops at Batano, while evacuating 190 Dutch soldiers and 150 Portuguese civilians. The launch HMAS Guru was used to ferry the passengers between the shore and 2 corvettes, HMAS Armidale and Castlemaine. However, Armidale, carrying the Dutch reinforcements, was sunk by Japanese aircraft and almost all of those on board were lost. Also during November, the Australian Army's Public Relations Branch arranged to send the Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker Damien Pera, and a war correspondent named Bill Marion, to Timor. Pera's film, Men of Timor, was later greeted with enthusiasm by audiences in Allied countries. Australian Withdrawal, December 1942 – February 1943. By the end of 1942, the chances of the Allies retaking Timor were remote, as there were now 12,000 Japanese troops on the island and the commandos were coming into increasing contact with the enemy. The Australian Chiefs of Staff estimated that it would take at least 3 Allied divisions, with strong air and naval support, to recapture the island. Indeed, as the Japanese efforts to wear down the Australians and to separate them from the native support became more effective, the commandos had found their operations becoming increasingly untenable. Likewise, with the Australian Army fighting a number of costly battles against the Japanese beachheads around Buna in New Guinea, there were currently insufficient resources to continue operations in Timor. As such, from early December, Australian operations on Timor would be progressively wound down. On 11–12 December, the remainder of the original Sparrow Force, except for a few officers, was evacuated with Portuguese civilians by the Dutch destroyer HNLM St. Meanwhile, in the first week of January the decision was made to withdraw Lancer Force. On the night of 9/10 January 1943, the bulk of the 2, 4th and 50 Portuguese were evacuated by the destroyer HMAS Arunta. A small intelligence team known as S-Force was left behind, but its presence was soon detected by the Japanese. With the remnants of Lancer Force, S-Force made its way to the eastern tip of Timor, where the Australian British said Special Unit was also operating. They were evacuated by the American submarine Gudgeon on the 10th of February. 40 Australian commandos were killed during this phase of the fighting, while 1,500 Japanese were believed to have died. Captivity. After capitulation on the 23rd of February 1942, those captured were held at the USAPA Besar Power Camp. Many officers that were considered troublemakers were sent to Java and Changi in August 1942. On the 23rd of September 1942, the rest of Sparrow Force were transported to Surabaya in the hold of an old Chinese freighter, the hull ship Dainichi Maru. Sailing via Dili, the ship came under attack from Royal Australian Air Force bombers and Royal Navy and Dutch submarines. After reaching Surabaya, they travelled by train to Batavia and marched 11 miles to Makassar, where the British, Dutch and Australians were separated. The Australians were based around Tanjong Priok initially, while the British joined the RAF prisoners in No. 5 camp, and the Dutch were sent to another camp. On the 15th of October the British was broken up and sent to different parts of Southeast Asia. Some were held on Java, while on the 18th of October the rest of the battery boarded the freighters Singapore Maru and Oshida Maru to endure a one-week voyage to Singapore. Those Australians that were fit to travel were sent to Singapore during the same period. At Singapore, the Sparrow Force men were marched 15 miles to Changi Barracks, where they were medically examined and assessed for employment in labour camps. Throughout Southeast Asia, some were sent to work on the Siam-Burma Railway, while others were sent to build a railway on Sumatra and sent to work in labour camps in Japan. Others remained in Singapore at Changi Prison. Those who travelled to Japan to work in labour camps endured 46 days on the hull ship Dainichi Maru and Tofuku Maru. Most casualties were aboard these hull ships, with many suffering from disease after disembarking at Moji. In Japan, those who had been transported on the Tofuku Maru were moved by train to Hiroka, where they were held at the Tokyo No. 2 Detached Power Camp. There they worked to build the Hiroka Dam. In April 1944, most of the gunners were sent by train to the Tokyo No. 16 Power Camp in Kannos to stoke furnaces in the carbide factory. Those gunners who disembarked the Dainichi Maru joined the Fukuoka No. 1 Power Camp. This group was later split up and relocated to camps in Moji, Kumamoto, Oreo, Ube, Oman and Bibai. Many died from disease or accidents in labor camps on the Siam-Burma Railway, in Sumatra, Japan, Java, Borneo, and Changi Prison. Later in the war, 120 died when the hull ships were sunk by United States Navy submarine en route to Japan from Singapore.